Thanks for joining me. The question today, why do we do the things we do? Sigmund Freud thought it was about sex and repression. Maslow thought that we were, climbing some sort of pyramid like motivational mountain goats. The big five says we're a neat set of numbers. So who's right? And more importantly, what's missing? This is Automatic Mouth. Thank you for joining me again as we continue our journey into personality. Today, we're zooming out again. As I said last week, we're going to get a little bit bigger, zoom a little bit bigger, and we're going to look at comparing some of the really big frameworks, asking what they tell us, asking what they don't tell us about being human and working out why we do the things we do. And before we dive into that, I also want to make a point of saying that much of the modern work on personality theory centers around traits. Now, a trait is basically a consistent pattern in how you think, feel, or act. It's not about what you did once on a bad day. Just snapping at someone doesn't make you a snappy person. That's not a trait. Okay. It's the tendencies that show up across time and across situations as well. For example, a person with who is high in the trait of extroversion, they don't just talk a lot at parties. They also tend to enjoy being around people quite a lot of the time. They feel energized by social gatherings and settings, and they seek out stimulation. So traits are like the personality settings, if you will. They stay fairly stable over your life, even if the volume gets turned up or turned down, depending on the context. A metaphor that I think works well to understand traits is coffee. Trait is like your usual coffee order. Sure, sometimes you might get a little bit crazy and have some sort of I'm going to try a macchiato, or I'm going to have a pumpkin spice latte or something. You do something a little bit wild. However, 9 times out of 10, you're going to straight up get that, cappuccino with vanilla on soy. You've got your standard kind of drink. Traits are like that. Traits is the stuff that you keep coming back to. Okay? All right. So with that said, let's take a cheeky look at the evolution of personality psychology together. So let's go right back to Freud and early psychodynamics. We're talking around the 1900s here. So Freud wasn't thinking in traits per se, but drives and conflicts was his big thing. He focused on the unconscious, not stable patterns of behavior. Still, when you look into his work, you can see the seeds of traits being planted there. Someone being anxious or impulsive or rigid. However, the difference was that Freud chalked those up to being inner battles rather than an enduring dimension or trait. Then we move into the humanistic era, which is the 40s, the 60s. That's Maslow, his hierarchy of needs, Rogers. The focus here shifted to growth and potential. Now, they weren't talking about traits either as such, but they focused on needs, authenticity, self-actualization, that sort of stuff. And again, there's overlaps though with traits. Someone open to experience looks a lot like Maslow's self-actualization person. Rogers' fully functioning individual sounds a lot like the openness and high agreeableness that you find in trait theory. So then let's get into the trait revolution. We're talking the 50s onwards, and we're talking people like Eysenck, Cattell, the big five, Ocean. In this era was where psychology started to really lean more into statistics. So instead of being heavy on theorizing, they started really diving into gathering data and running things like factor analysis and identifying stable dimensions of a personality. So, for example, Eysenck's pen theory, which you may have heard before, it's that there are three core traits. And this is where the word came into it. The Penn traits that he focused on were psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. And his theory is that those three are rooted in genetics. So that's what Penn is. And the big five is ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. All of those, though, the three, the five, that it's about boiling down, that's factor analysis, from Cattell's 16 PF theory, which was 16 traits. And so you could see what they were looking to do is gather data and try and find out, are there core traits that you can see that things branch off into? Yeah. Either way, what this did, this trait revolution, is it really gave psychology a way to measure personality in a more reliable and testable way, something that could be replicated. So you can see where personality moved from being about the unconscious and dreams and things like that, and it moved into a science and doing our best to measure it. So traits were always hiding in the background. As I said, Freud described people as neurotic or repressed. Now, those sound like traits, but he saw them as a symptom of unconscious conflict. Maslow described people striving to grow. Again, very trait-like, but he framed it as motivation. So it wasn't until the mid-20th century that psychologists said, well, look, hang on, what if personality is best described as stable patterns, and then we can measure it? So, as I said, that's where the modern trait theories, like the Big Five, took off. So I guess what I'm getting at, traits aren't new. They're just the scientific rebrand of what everyone's been noticing all along. We're just starting to really bring it in and be able to put a name to things and measure them. However, not perfect. Let's look at what they miss, okay? Context is a big thing, isn't it? We're not cookie cutter people, are we? We don't behave the same way in all settings. A lot of us, most of us probably, have a work self and a family self and a going out with friends self. I'm sure yourself or someone you see a different side of them perhaps when they get back with old school friends. And you think, oh, geez, wow, okay, there's a side of you I haven't seen. We behave differently in different settings. So context is a big thing that gets missed in a lot of personality profiling and tests, etc., because it's really a snapshot of right there and then, isn't it? Another big miss is about culture. So most research in the personality psychology field is weird. When I say weird, I mean all in capitals, UEIRD. And that actually stands for being that the people that a lot of the theories are based on, a lot of the data has come from, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. It fits into the weird categories. So it doesn't translate neatly to all populations. Big problem. Meaning and story is something else that gets missed, which to me also kind of links with culture, because meaning and story is very closely connected, isn't it, with identity in one's culture. So traits measure what you are, not who you believe you are. So the narrative identity is pretty much ignored. Yeah. When you look at personality profiling through an NLP lens, when we study NLP, we have an understanding and we learn that language and beliefs are central to your personality, central to your identity and who you believe you are. But in most models of personality psychology, it's absent. It's not even taken into account. So the takeaway from this is that no model, and you can see I've covered quite a few in the last few weeks that we've looked at personality profiling. There's no one model that captures in its entirety the richness of human identity, nor its kaleidoscope nature of changeability. And that's something that's really beautiful about being human. So think of it this way. Personality psychology is like trying to paint a portrait of a person using only the primary colors. So each theory adds a shade, but none completes a picture on its own. Does that make sense? It did to me when I wrote it. Apologies if it doesn't now. Either way, from what I've said today, I encourage you to reflect on that. Which theory feels more like home to you? What makes more sense to you? Which one makes you roll your eyes and think, what were they thinking? It's good to tease these things out and see where you sit with them, and to also see how they've evolved. Even that, that little, what character am I from Game of Thrones? What type of cat am I? All those sorts of personality type quizzes that we love to do on social media. They all have the same background and come from the same roots. So it's interesting to see where they all come from. Now, next week, as I said, this was just a really quick little evolution of looking at, how personality psychology came about and why we are where we are now. Next week will be our last episode on personality profiling. I'm going to look at how these theories show up in the real world. Let's talk personality profiling in business, in relationships, and in social media, as we just discussed. So I look forward to you meeting me next week and listening in. Let me know what you think about personality theory, what you've learned so far, and we'll finish it off. We'll wrap it up next week. I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.